So imagine a country that's roughly the size of New Jersey, or really just the population of a mid-sized American city.
Right, something pretty small, geographically speaking.
Exactly. And they have no oil, like zero. No special natural resources to speak of at all.
Which is usually a death knell for a developing economy in that region.
Right. And on top of that, they're completely surrounded by enemies. We're talking about a place that faces deep hostility at the UN. They're a constant target for terrorism, and they deal with condemnation from celebrities, boycotts, slander, just relentless attacks.
The psychological friction of that daily reality is, well, it's basically off the charts.
It is. But here is where it gets crazy. You open up the latest macroeconomic data, and this exact same country is thriving. Like thriving as if there is no tomorrow.
Yeah, the data is staggering. It creates this immediate sense of cognitive dissonance.
Completely. I mean, they are an absolute juggernaut. In the army, in medicine, in technology, in agriculture, they're taking actual deserts and turning them into agricultural fields.
And they're pulling drinking water out of the air,
Yeah.
literally.
Yes. Intercepting rockets mid-flight, rescuing hostages, literally from under the noses of some of the most brutal regimes in the world. And they survive and even win these wars that everyone is absolutely certain will wipe them off the map.
When you look at the raw data, your brain almost rejects it because it violates basically every fundamental rule we have for how nation states and economies are, supposed to operate under that kind of duress.
It's like reading a physics paper where gravity just suddenly works in reverse. Everything we know about societal stress says this nation should be collapsing, and yet the data says it's skyrocketing.
It shatters the model.
It really does.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what we were exploring today. So welcome, everyone. If you're listening to this deep dive right now, you know our mission is to cut through the noise. And today we are unpacking one of the most profound geopolitical, economic, and philosophical paradoxes of the modern era.
And we have a massive stack of sources for this one. I mean, incredibly diverse material.
Oh, yeah. We're looking at official macroeconomic reports from the Bank of Israel from early 2026, high-tech and climate-tech industry analyses. And we're cross-referencing all of that with historical encyclopedias covering the absolute darkest chapters of human history.
Not to mention sports journalism breaking down Olympic strategies and this really deeply provocative philosophical essay by a British journalist named Alistair Heath.
Right, alongside texts from Israeli writers like Miriam Amud, it is a vast spectrum of material.
It is. But there's a very specific mechanical thread tying it all together.
Exactly. Because if you want to understand the true mechanics of resilience, like how a system or a society or even you as an individual can take an existential threat and turn it into unprecedented innovation, this deep dive is the ultimate case study.
Yeah, to understand how that transmutation actually works, you have to look at the starting line.
Right. You can't just start with a balance sheet in 2026.
Exactly. To understand why the modern statistics of this nation are such a wild anomaly, we have to establish the absolute zero from which this modern state emerged.
And when you say absolute zero, that isn't just a metaphor.
No, it's not an exaggeration at all. If we pull from our historical sources like Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Encyclopedia, and some really extensive historical discourse from forums like Reddit's Ask Historians, we have to confront the period between 1933 and 1945.
The Shoah.
Yes. And we need to look at the structural, sociological mechanics of what happened. The sources detail the murder of approximately 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators.
And I want to pause there because the Ask Historians thread we analyzed makes a really unsettling point about how people today process that number.
What do they say?
They point out that people even today constantly question the numbers, the scale, the logistics of it. And they argue it's because human brains literally cannot compute that level of industrialized destruction.
That makes sense. That's the crucial distinction Yad Vashem and the historical encyclopedias emphasize. This wasn't, standard collateral damage from a war.
Right.
This was a highly bureaucratized, industrialized system engineered specifically for human extermination.
The methods are just devastating. You have the ghettos, places like Warsaw and Minsk, and the mechanics there were basically about density and starvation, right?
Yeah, you took hundreds of thousands of people, compressed them into a few square miles, cut off the supply chains, and just wait.
And then the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads in the USSR, where the execution was literally face-to-face, village by village.
And finally, the extermination camps, which were essentially factories. The raw material was human beings, and the output was ash.
It's horrific to even conceptualize. But what does this mean from a macro societal standpoint, beyond the immediate, unimaginable loss of life?
Structurally, it was the erasure of human capital and cultural infrastructure on a scale that usually ends a civilization entirely.
Wow. End of story, usually.
Yeah. Think about the Yiddish language, for example. Before the war, it was the vibrant, everyday language for millions of people across Europe.
Right. It was used in literature, theater, commerce.
Exactly. And in a matter of years, that entire linguistic ecosystem was just wiped off the map. Centuries of wealth, generational knowledge, art, community leadership, all incinerated.
Which, if you look at historical precedents, like the Babylonians or the Romans, when a persecuted, exiled people face that level of systematic erasure, what happens?
They vanish, they assimilate into whoever conquered them, or they scatter to the winds. They just cease to exist as a cohesive identity in the historical record.
Because the sociological gravity dictates that they disappear.
Exactly. And the demographic devastation is staggering. Our sources note that even by the year 2024, the pre-war global Jewish population had still not fully recovered its numbers.
Wait, really? Even by 2024?
Yes. Think about the compounding interest of human reproduction over 80 years. The demographic crater was so deep that nearly a century later, the population graph still hadn't caught up to where it was in 1939.
Wow, so that is our baseline. Total societal annihilation.
Yeah.
And from that crater, we fast forward to the modern macroeconomic reality of 2025 and 2026.
Right, we move from the historical devastation to the modern ledger.
And this is where, like we said, the laws of physics seem to just break down. Because logically, a country at war, recovering from the massive shocks of 2023, living in a hostile neighborhood, that economy should be in a death spiral.
By all traditional economic models, yes, it absolutely should be bleeding out.
I mean, when a country is fighting a sustained multi-front war, foreign direct investment usually flees. Right?
Yeah.
Because capital hates risk.
Exactly. Capital is terrified of uncertainty. You also expect inflation to spiral because supply chains break and governments just start printing money to fund the military.
Right, and the local currency should just tank against the dollar.
That is the standard mechanism of a wartime economy, yes.
But let's look at the actual data from the sources. We have a report from Cursor Info citing The Economist. And for 2025, they ranked Israel as the third most successful economy in the world.
It's a staggering ranking.
Third, out of the entire globe. I mean, wait, how is a country literally managing a multi-front conflict and facing global boycotts, outperforming peaceful European nations?
It seems impossible, but the underlying data from the Bank of Israel validates it entirely. Let's look at their January 2026 press release.
Okay, lay it out for us.
They held interest rates steady at 4%. And inflation, which, as we just discussed, is usually the great destroyer of wartime economies, actually moderated down to 2.4%.
I have to push back here because this doesn't make sense mechanically. How are they controlling inflation while funding a massive war effort? Are they just artificially suppressing prices?
No, it's not artificial price controls. It's about managing labor and supply constraints with hyper-efficiency.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, the Bank of Israel report explains that as the initial shock of the late 2023 conflict subsided, the military began releasing reservists in highly calculated phases.
Oh, I see. So the workforce came back.
Exactly. This easing of labor supply constraints meant businesses could resume operations, tech companies got their engineers back, and domestic production stabilized.
So the domestic market didn't collapse, it just adapted.
Right. And the report points to credit card expenditures as a key indicator here. Domestic consumption remained incredibly robust. People didn't just hoard cash in their mattresses out of fear, they kept the economic engine running.
And then there's Bank Leumi's stock, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sources say it surged by 70%.
Yes, which is a huge indicator of confidence in the domestic financial sector.
But wait, there's another data point here that is even crazier to me. The shekel actually strengthened against the US dollar and the euro, despite the geopolitical chaos.
Yeah, that's the part that really confuses traditional analysts.
How is a currency strengthening when the country is dealing with daily kinetic threats and international boycotts?
That brings us to a really fascinating metric mentioned in the sources, the risk premium, specifically the CDS spread.
Okay, let's unpack that for everyone listening. What exactly is a CDS spread and why does it matter here?
So, CDS stands for credit default swap. Think of it like buying fire insurance on a house.
Okay.
If you buy a house in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, the insurance premium is very low. But if you buy a house in a forest that is currently on fire, the premium is astronomical because the risk of the house burning down is incredibly high.
Oh, right. Makes total sense.
A CDS spread is essentially the insurance premium that investors pay to protect themselves against a country defaulting on its national debt.
So logically, Israel's CDS spread should be through the roof. I mean, the house is literally in a forest fire.
Exactly. And initially, during the massive shocks of 2023, it did spike. But the 2026 Bank of Israel data shows that the risk premium returned to pre-war levels.
Like pre-war levels, while the war is still ongoing.
Yes. The global financial markets, which remember are completely unsentimental and care only about cold, hard math, they looked at the underlying mechanics of the Israeli economy, priced in the risk of the war, and decided, actually, this economy is entirely solid. They are not going to default.
Wow. So foreign capital continued to flow in, which strengthens the shekel.
Exactly. The math outweighed the geopolitical panic.
And the World Bank data completely backs this up. In 2025, Israel's GDP per capita exceeded $60,000.
Which is higher than the Eurozone average.
Right. They are wealthier per person than many of the very countries in Europe that are actively lecturing them on how to run their affairs. It's like a company reporting record profits while its headquarters is on fire.
It's a great analogy. And the OECD predicts a massive 4.9% GDP growth for Israel in 2026 and 4.6% in 2027.
Just to put that in perspective for you listening, the OECD average growth prediction for other developed nations is just 1.8%.
So they are vastly outpacing the average, by a factor of almost 3.
Okay, but this begs the obvious question. What is actually fueling this? We already established they have no oil, they aren't sitting on massive natural resource reserves. If you're outgrowing Europe while fighting a war, what is the actual engine under the hood?
The engine is human capital, and a sheer obsession with solving impossible problems.
Human capital.
Yeah, it is the monetization of survival. If we dive into the 2025 State of High Tech report and the 2024-2025 ClimateTech report from the Israel Innovation Authority, we see the exact mechanisms driving this.
Okay, let's look at the High Tech report. It says Israel remains the 5th largest hub globally for startup fundraising.
Behind only San Francisco, New York, London, and Boston.
Which is insane. You have an entire nation, again, the size of New Jersey, competing directly with Silicon Valley and Wall Street for venture capital.
And the efficiency of this sector is what's truly anomalous. The report notes that high-tech employment has actually stagnated a bit, hovering around 11.5% of the national workforce.
Okay, so just over 1 in 10 people.
Right. But here is the critical mechanism. That 11.5% of the workforce is responsible for 57% of the country's total export.
Wait, what?
Yeah. 57%. We are talking about $78 billion in 2024 alone.
So 10% of the people are carrying almost 60% of the export economy on their backs. That isn't just an industry, that's like a national vital organ.
Precisely. And the venture capital isn't flowing into trivial consumer apps, like food delivery or basic social media. The focus is overwhelmingly on deep tech.
Let's define deep tech for the listener, because it sounds like a tech buzzword, but the sources treat it as a very specific economic category.
Yeah. Deep tech refers to companies that are tackling profound, highly complex engineering and scientific challenges.
So not just a new algorithm for a feed.
Exactly. We are talking about quantum computing, advanced materials science, next-generation cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence that requires years of deep research and development before a product ever hits the market.
Which means the risk profile there is massive. It requires immense patient capital.
Yes. And the sources show there are over 1,500 active deep tech companies in Israel absorbing massive investments. In fact, cybersecurity and organizational software accounted for 3 out of every 5 shekels raised in 2025.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about their geopolitical situation.
Yes.
I mean, they are the most cyber-attacked nation on earth. They essentially use their own national security infrastructure as a beta testing ground for commercial products. But where it gets really fascinating to me is the climate tech sector. Our sources show 946 startups specifically dedicated to climate solutions.
The climate tech data is perhaps the most revealing part of the whole stack. The Israel Innovation Authority granted $105 million to over 600 ventures in 2024 alone.
And remember the context for you listening. This was during a war.
Exactly. Logistics were disrupted, commercial flights were constantly being canceled, which made travel to pitch investors nearly impossible for some founders, and multinational partnerships were under intense political strain.
Yet this sector proved insanely resilient.
Highly resilient, because they aren't just trying to solve climate change to be, green or trendy. They are solving it because it's a matter of absolute national survival.
Let's look at the specifics mentioned in the sources. They are developing novel food processing and climate-smart agriculture. And My absolute favorite, they are literally developing technology to pull drinking water directly out of the air.
Atmospheric water generation.
Yes. How does that actually work mechanically? It sounds like magic.
Well, at a basic level, atmospheric water generation technology uses advanced condensation and desiccant systems to extract humidity from the ambient air, purify it, and turn it into potable water.
Wow.
But the real challenge isn't just extracting the water, it's doing it in a highly energy-efficient way, often using solar power, so it can be deployed in off-grid, arid environments.
Which goes right back to the core premise. They don't have abundant natural fresh water. They are largely a desert, so they can't just rely on rainfall.
Right.
They don't just import water either. They invent world-leading eco-efficient water infrastructure. They invent reverse osmosis desalination that is so efficient it changes global standards.
Exactly. And they don't have vast expanses of fertile land, so they invent precision agriculture.
Like drip irrigation, where sensors deliver the exact micro amount of water needed to a specific plant's roots, right?
Spot on. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the ultimate adapt or die ecosystem. The existential threats serve as this high-pressure technological incubator. And there is a secondary structural mechanism at play here that people often overlook.
What's that?
Because they are surrounded by hostile neighbors, an Israeli startup has absolutely no local, regional market to sell its products to.
Oh, that's a fascinating point. If you launch a startup in France, you can immediately sell your software or your agricultural tech to Germany, Italy, Spain. You have this massive integrated regional market right next door.
Exactly. But an Israeli startup cannot sell to Lebanon or Syria. This geopolitical headwind actually acts as a massive long-term advantage.
Really?
Because it forces the tech sector into global integration from day one. When a founder in Tel Aviv writes their first line of code or files their first patent, they already know they have to build a product that is viable in the United States, in Europe, or in Asia.
Wow.
They are forced to be globally competitive and globally scaled from the moment of inception.
So the hostility literally forces them to skip the minor leagues and immediately play in the majors. They aren't just adapting to survive in their own neighborhood. They're adapting to lead the world.
Exactly.
And you see this technological and economic leadership touching every sphere. It even bleeds into international politics. We've got sources neutrally reporting on headlines like Donald Trump being slated for the Israel Prize, which is the nation's highest cultural and scientific honor.
Right.
Now, regardless of the politics surrounding any specific figure, what's fascinating is how deeply a tiny nation's domestic affairs and awards intersect with major global political awareness. Their footprint is entirely disproportionate to their physical size.
That global footprint is the direct downstream result of relying purely on intellectual capital rather than physical resources. But if we stop the analysis here, we are missing half the picture. Because economic metrics, venture capital raises, and software code, those are the outputs of a system. To truly understand the mechanics of this society, you have to look at the inputs, you have to look at their culture, you have to look at the human spirit.
Right. How does a population steeped in historical trauma and current existential anxiety translate that into human performance on an individual level?
Exactly. This is where the data gets incredibly human. Let's pivot from the economy and talk about the 2024 Paris Olympics.
I love this part of the deep dive.
The athletic spirit we see in the sources is a fascinating mirror to the high-tech sector we just discussed. According to the detailed reporting from Ynet News, Israel achieved a historic haul at the Paris Olympics.
6 medals across 3 different sports.
Right, including an incredible gold medal by Tom Ravini in windsurfing.
Now, if you are listening to this in the United States or China, 6 medals might sound like a quiet Tuesday. But you have to look at it per capita. For a country of this size, with its resources heavily diverted to defense, winning 6 Olympic medals is a massive statistical anomaly.
It really is.
And what I love about the Ynet source is that it breaks down exactly how this happened. Because it wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just a couple of genetically gifted athletes who got lucky on the day.
Not at all. It was the result of a highly calculated, heavily data-driven strategy that perfectly mirrors their venture capital ecosystem.
How so? What is the actual mechanism of data-driven Olympic sports?
Well, the Olympic Committee and the sports ministry didn't just throw money at the wall. They implemented multi-year strategic planning. They essentially acted like an athletic incubator. Take windsurfing, where they won gold.
Okay.
It's not just about an athlete getting on a board and riding the wind. They hired full-time data analysts. They track micro-weather patterns, ocean currents, the aerodynamic drag of specific equipment tweaks, and the biomechanics of the athlete.
So they're modeling windsurfing like it's a deep tech startup.
Exactly. They evaluate potential areas of competitive advantage with the same rigorous quantitative modeling that a tech company uses to evaluate market fit.
And they backed it up with capital. The source notes the sports budget was increased by 30%. But think about the context of that for a second. This is a massive paradox.
In what way?
Usually when a nation is locked in a multi-front war, what is the very first thing to get cut from the government ledger? The luxury budgets. You slash funding for the arts, for recreation, for sports, because you need every available dollar to buy interceptor missiles and fund troops.
Logically, yes. You cut the non-essentials.
But here, they increased it. It seems like competing on the world stage and standing on that podium is viewed not as a luxury, but as an absolute necessity. It is a national proof of life.
Proof of life is exactly the right phrase. The Ynet article heavily emphasizes the psychological weight of the Paris Games. We really have to consider the mental state of these athletes.
Right.
They were training and competing while their home country was at war. They were facing severe, unprecedented security threats and intense hostility just by showing up in Paris.
The friction must have been immense.
Unbelievable friction. Every time they stepped onto the judo mat or into the water or onto the gymnastics floor, they knew they weren't just representing themselves. They were carrying the morale of an entire traumatized nation on their shoulders.
Wow.
Their victories weren't just personal athletic milestones. They functioned as critical psychological anchors for the civilian population back home.
And if you look at the structure of their athletic programs, it is so deliberate. They use former Olympic medalists like Gail Fridman and Oren Smaga as the head coaches for the current generation.
Right.
It's the exact same mentorship model you see in their high-tech sector, where the founders who successfully built and sold startups a decade ago are now the angel investors and mentors for the new crop of entrepreneurs.
Right.
They don't let their human capital retire. They recycle the expertise to maximize their limited resources.
We also see the scale of athletic ambition internally with the Maccabi Games, which is often referred to as the Jewish Olympics.
Right. Our sources have a lot of historical data on that.
Yeah, it's an international multi-sport event that brings roughly 10,000 athletes from 80 different countries together in Israel. And it is slated to happen again in the summer of 2026.
10,000 athletes flying into a country during an era of immense security tension. That is a logistical mountain to climb.
Oh, absolutely.
The security overlay alone for housing and transporting 10,000 international athletes is mind-boggling. But again, the pattern holds. They don't cancel it. They don't shrink from the logistical nightmare. They double down.
And this drive for excellence isn't limited to the athletic field. The government sources regarding the 2025 Israel Prize, which we established, is their highest civilian honor note, a significant cultural milestone.
Oh, right. The demographic shift in the winners.
Exactly. For the first time in the history of the prize, 50% of the honors were awarded to women.
Which reflects a profound structural push for societal excellence, equity, and representation across all disciplines, whether that's literature, life sciences, or social work.
The common denominator across all these seemingly disparate data points: an Olympic windsurfer analyzing drag coefficients, a ClimateTech entrepreneur engineering atmospheric water generators, or a Nobel-level scientist receiving the Israel Prize, is a society that fundamentally refuses to merely endure its circumstances.
Right, because endurance is passive.
Exactly. This society insists on active excellence.
Okay, so let's take a step back and look at the whole board we've laid out for you today. We have the quantitative data. We have the booming economy, the strengthening shekel, the narrowing CDS spreads. We have the deep tech startups and the agricultural innovations.
Yeah.
We have the qualitative data, the Olympic medals, the Maccabi Games, the cultural milestones. And we have the historical context, the absolute devastation of the Holocaust from which this all emerged.
The mechanics of the paradox are very clear at this point.
They are. We've explained the what and we've explained the how. But this brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most thought-provoking part of our deep dive, the why.
This is a crucial pivot.
Specifically, why does this specific success story bother so much of the rest of the world?
Because the reaction to this anomaly is just as fascinating as the anomaly itself.
Exactly. Why does this tiny, thriving nation elicit such a visceral, often furious reaction globally? When you see a country doing well, the normal human response is either indifference or mild admiration. But here, the success generates intense scrutiny and often outrage. The world watches and just cannot understand it.
Right. And to understand this reaction, we are looking at a deeply philosophical essay by British journalist Alistair Heath alongside the writings of Miriam Amud, which were provided in our source stack.
And as we unpack this, it's important to state that we are approaching this impartially, simply analyzing the philosophical and sociological arguments these writers are presenting.
Absolutely. So Alistair Heath presents a very specific structural thesis. He argues that Israel's survival, and more importantly, its disproportionate success, creates deep psychological discomfort in the global community because it defies all established logic.
It goes back to the cognitive dissonance we talked about at the very beginning. A nation this small, with no natural resources, born out of genocide and surrounded by enemies, simply shouldn't be this strong.
According to Heath's analysis, when people look at this impossible success, their brains essentially short-circuit. Human beings crave narrative consistency.
Right. We want the world to make sense.
Exactly. When a reality breaks the established rules, it causes profound psychological discomfort. So what is the natural human defense mechanism against cognitive dissonance?
You search for a logical loophole. You try to explain away the anomaly so your worldview doesn't have to change. When a person is confronted with a force they can't explain, they desperately search for another explanation.
Exactly. Heath argues that people desperately search for what we might call a dark trick.
And the sources outline exactly what those supposed dark tricks are. People look at the tech sector and the military dominance and say, well, it must just be American financial aid propping them up.
Or it must be the result of a powerful, shadowy international lobby pulling strings behind the scenes.
Right. Or they frame it purely through a lens of oppression or theft. The narrative becomes, they aren't actually innovating, they're just exploiting.
And Heath asks the critical analytical question, why are people so desperate to cling to these dark trick explanations even when the macroeconomic data, like a tech sector producing $78 billion in exports, clearly shows internal organic innovation?
And his conclusion is wild. He argues that people cling to the dark trick theory because the alternative explanations are absolutely terrifying to the established modern worldview.
What are the alternatives, he points out?
Well, the first alternative is that perhaps they actually deserve their success. That through sheer grit, hyper-efficient human capital management, and relentless innovation, they have simply outworked and outsmarted the systems built by larger nations.
And accepting that means other nations might have to take accountability for their own structural failures, which is, deeply uncomfortable.
But the second alternative is the one that really shakes the foundations. The essay points out the poetic, almost unbelievable historical reality. The argument is that there is no historical precedent for this.
None.
You have a people surviving the Babylonians, the Romans, the Crusaders, the Inquisition, the pogroms, and the industrialized slaughter of the Holocaust, only to return to their ancestral homeland, revive a 2,000-year-old dead language, and go to work in a high-rise in Tel Aviv on a Monday morning.
It reads exactly like a mythological epic, but it is happening in real time, in the real world.
Exactly. It's not just politics. It's almost biblical. There's no logical way to go from gas chambers to global influence.
This is where Miriam Amid's text expands the philosophical framework. She introduces the concept of everyday miracles.
How does she define an everyday miracle in a modern technological context?
She points to the modern reality of the conflict. She writes about scenarios where hundreds of advanced rockets are fired simultaneously at civilian population centers, resulting in almost zero casualties. Now, a strict materialist or engineer will point entirely to the technological marvel of the Iron Dome and advanced radar early warning systems.
Which are undeniably incredible feats of engineering. I mean, shooting down rockets in midair is sci-fi stuff.
They are. But Amid argues that at a certain volume, the sheer mathematical probability of survival becomes so low that it defies mere technological explanation.
Oh, I see.
When you stack the historical survival against empires next to the modern survival against localized kinetic threats, she argues it approaches the inexplicable. She's positing that to an observer, this survival borders on the miraculous.
And Heath's essay dovetails perfectly with this. He argues that people prefer to call a miracle a fraud or a dark trick because dealing with a miracle requires you to completely rewrite your understanding of how the universe operates.
If we unpack the true philosophical weight of Heath's argument, it is profound. He is suggesting that if a nation's survival and prosperity is viewed not just as an impressive feat of engineering, but as something potentially divine, or at the very least profoundly unrandom, it fundamentally shakes the global moral compass.
Because it threatens the secular, materialist status quo.
Exactly. It forces individuals and nations to reconsider their foundational concepts of power, history, and justice.
Right.
If history is just a series of random, chaotic events where the strong conquer the weak, then the story of the world makes sense to a materialist. Empires rise, they crush the weak, they fall. It's biological determinism.
But if the survival of this specific ancient tiny nation indicates that history actually has an arc, a purpose, or a non-random element, if it suggests that perhaps God, or at least a binding historical destiny, is not a myth but an active participant in history, that changes the narrative entirely.
It changes the story from the end of a dying empire to the beginning of something eternal.
And to established worldviews, that concept is deeply unsettling. It means the rules of the game are not what we thought they were.
Exactly.
It is so much easier to be angry at an anomaly than to admit you don't understand the rules of the universe anymore. It is infinitely easier to invent a political conspiracy theory than to accept the possibility that history isn't random, or that an ancient people is simply out-innovating and out-surviving everyone else against all mathematical odds.
That is the crux of the philosophical paradox our sources present. The friction we see at the UN or in global discourse isn't just about borders or standard geopolitical maneuvering. According to Heath and Amude, the friction is existential.
Right.
It is about what the very survival and thriving of this nation represents to the rest of the world's understanding of reality.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now? Why should you care about the macroeconomic data of a country the size of New Jersey, or their Olympic windsurfing strategies, or the philosophical debates about their historical survival?
It's the ultimate question.
Because whether you look at this through the cold, hard, entirely secular data of GDP growth and climate tech venture capital, or you look at it through the strategic, meticulous triumphs of their athletic programs, or you look at it through the deep philosophical lens of defying historical erasure, Israel represents the ultimate real-world case study in what the statistician Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility.
Anti-fragility is the perfect conceptual framework here. Let's explain that mechanism.
Go ahead.
A fragile system breaks under stress. A robust system simply resists stress and stays the same. But an anti-fragile system actually requires stress to improve.
It's like human muscle tissue. If you sit on the couch, the muscle atrophies. It is only when you apply intense stress and friction to the muscle, when you literally tear the fibers by lifting weights, that the body responds by building the muscle back denser and stronger.
Right.
It is muscle hypertrophy applied to a nation state.
Precisely. They don't just endure the volatility, the shock, and the existential threat. They use those exact stressors as the very fuel to grow wealthier, more cohesive, and more innovative. The friction is the feature, not the bug.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to explore on your own. We spent this entire deep dive looking at how the greatest bursts of innovation, economic resilience, and cultural revival in this society were born directly out of absolute existential threat and deep historical adversity. So what does that say about human nature as a whole?
It's a huge question.
Do we actually require the credible threat of extinction to reach our absolute highest potential?
It is a sobering, almost uncomfortable question to ask ourselves. If extreme adversity and the constant requirement to prove your right to exist is the prerequisite for this kind of hyper-innovation, can a society or even an individual ever truly achieve greatness in total comfort?
Exactly. Think about your own life. What does that mean for how we live our own comfortable, air-conditioned, low-friction lives? If the data suggests that the human engine only truly unlocks its ultimate potential when the world around it is on fire, maybe we need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with adversity. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to eliminate friction, but learning how to harness it. Until next time, keep diving deep.